Welcome back to the How Soccer Explains Leadership. Thanks again for being a part of the conversation. We have another great show. I'm Phil Dark, your host. Got Paul Jobson here with me, and we also have another Paul with us today. We got Paul McVeigh. We're here the morning of the semifinal of the World Cup, a World Cup where I will say I picked very, very few right things. I'm not going to lie. So, Paul, I think we went back to that list that we put together at the beginning of that World Cup. It would not be very close to what we're seeing in this semi. But when this airs, semis are going to be over. So you're going to be saying, man, you guys got it wrong again, or man, you guys are brilliant. One of those two probably won't be the latter, even if we get the picks right. But Paul, how you doing, man? How have you enjoyed this cup?
Oh man, it's been awesome. And I think the fact that we didn't pick it correctly means it's been a great World Cup. I mean, I love the surprises. I love the
Yep.
back and forth. I love the fact that we're about to watch the first African nation in a semifinal this year, and just it's been so much fun to watch. I love the fact that you just don't know what's coming. So for me, that's been fun. I'm looking forward to when we get to the end to look back and see how badly we projected this tournament to be. And it's going to be a little confusing today, Paul, because I mean Phil and Paul, because there
Yeah.
are two Pauls on the call.
Right.
So we'll decipher what that is, but we'll know that from here on out, most of the questions are going to be for Paul McVeigh, our guest,
That's
and not
right.
for me. So I think we'll sort that out. But excited to get on here with Paul and get talking here about this conversation. So excited he's with us
Absolutely.
today.
We'll talk more about World Cup. I mean, I'm sure we'll spatter it in today. But we'll talk more about that in our post, or actually our halftime show for this season, which will likely be a World Cup review show as well. But we do today have Paul McVeigh. Paul played many years in the Premier League, has been actually got his master's in psychology as well. And from what I'm reading, the first Premier League player to do that. But Paul, correct me if I'm wrong on that. But Paul, how are you doing today, man?
Yeah, I'm embarrassingly well. Thanks very much for having me, guys. And I was just thinking that as I was about to dive in with the answer of the first question you asked, and I was like, "Oh, that's for Paul Jobson." I'll let you guys talk first of all, and then I'm sure we'll get on to my stuff later.
Yeah, we had another Phil on at some point too. So we figure it out. We figure it out. We will make this work. Um, so Paul McVeigh, we always like to start with just briefly sharing your story. I kind of teased it a little bit there, but really how you developed your passion for football, how you developed your passion for sport and performance psychology that you're doing today.
Yeah, it's well, how long have we got? Because it's it's a pretty long story. Unfortunately, even though I do look like a 14-year-old, but I've been in this elite performance environment for 30 years now. So it was whenever I left Belfast in Ireland, at the age of 16, and I was very very fortunate to go and join Tottenham Hotspur over in England, and for me that was just such a huge life event to be able to leave your family and friends behind. And I probably didn't realize at the time of just how significant that would be, and probably why my mum was in tears and uncontrollable sobbing,
Mm.
because she just knew I was never going to be coming home again, and leaving at the tender age of 16. But as a 16-year-old kid, I don't know what you guys were like, but all I wanted to do was play football. I just wanted to play professionally. I just wanted to be in that environment all the time. And so the first opportunity, I was grabbing with both hands, and it was really fascinating. And I suppose this is good because this next part of the story will probably resonate well with anyone who's listening across the US, because my first day at Tottenham Hotspur, I was very fortunate to train and play alongside a guy called Jurgen Klinsmann.
Mm.
And it was because Spurs had just signed him after the World Cup. They'd just been in the USA in '94, and Spurs signed him. And I remember just training next to this guy, and he was obviously already a World Cup winner at the time. He was an absolute global superstar, and incredibly humble as well, which was fascinating for me to have this perception of what World Cup winners could be like, and realizing how modest he was, and to be able to train with him on my first day. Probably for most of the guys, they were delighted. They were so energized and so happy to be with him. And unfortunately for me, it probably pronounced my inferiority complex that I had as a kid. And this is very tough to sort of to show when we're doing a call like this, when you guys are on the other side of the world, or where I am over in the UK. But I'm only 5'6". So I always probably had that inferiority complex, that it was always too small. I had lots of managers tell me I was too small. I could, competing against other teenagers. I was struggling to compete physically and even technically because they just developed faster and more than I was. So that really heightened it when I met Jurgen Klinsmann. And of course, as we'll probably get into the rest of the story, it was a tough start, but then very quickly get into this world of psychology and mindset and growth mindset. And it was actually by reading a book by a US author, a guy called Tony Robbins. And to be able to read a book of this kind of, in this ilk of personal development as a 17-year-old kid. And, it was quite a big chunky book. There was probably 500 pages in it. And for someone to offer that book to me, for me to read it, B, for me to then apply it to the things I was doing in my life, was just a complete game changer, because I suddenly went down a very, very different path than what I was currently going down.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna put you at ease today. I'm a 5'8" goalkeeper, and Paul is 5'2", I think, and so he is.
You guys are ginormous people. You're huge. You know, 5'6". You got 2 whole inches on me, Paul. So
you are.
I'm feeling you.
Yeah, you're in good.
Well, I've just
company.
learned, Phil, that the difference between like an average player and a great player is not anything more than just the 2 inches, 5'4" to 5'6". Had I been 2 inches taller, maybe.
And I was 2 inches too tall. And that I'm seeing that. And so I'm just a giant on this conversation. So I feel pretty good right now. I'm not.
Paul,
this
he's not going to want to
happen
get off
ever.
this call because he
This
feels
is
really tall
amazing.
right now. This is not going very well as we get started, Paul. But Paul, I think, I love that. I love hearing people's stories, and I think this as well as anybody. And the people that listen to this show hear this week in and week out how different everybody's story is when it comes to the game of football, and our paths are all so different. I think that could be a really encouraging thing to young people when they just see, in social media, one thing after the other it looks very, very similar, right? Time in and time out. But to know that everybody's story is different, and you kind of have to make your own story and follow whatever path that God has before you, or whatever that may be. So I appreciate the things that you share, and some great things that I know we'll dive more into. And you maybe hit a little bit of it, but in your let's dive into your playing career a little bit. What were some defining moments as a player that have really maybe directed your path now in the business world? What are some of those things maybe that, as you look back, kind of stand out as defining moments as a player? You can look back now as you're kind of running your own business and doing your day in and day out. You're like, okay, that's kind of made me who I am today as I interact with people through business.
Yeah, it's really interesting you asked that, because even last week I was delivering a keynote speech to one of our corporate clients as part of these kind of longer term leadership programs that we deliver, and the whole subject of failure came up in the conversation. And essentially we were trying to tease out from them, kind of what things do you want and what don't you want, and in the don't wants list came up that that they didn't really want failure or setbacks, and I was just started questioning, and I was like, well, why don't you want failure? Why don't you want setbacks? And they're like, well, no, who enjoys them? And, nobody likes that stuff. And I said, yeah, but how many opportunities are there for you to grow whenever these things happen? And if this is I suppose, the challenge that most people have, because, I don't think anyone sets out to fail, or no one sets out to come across these real obstacles in the road. But even if you look at if a team plays or an individual plays on a weekend, and they either play well or they win the match or they score, or whatever they want to do, afterwards there's probably way less analysis or introspection of how you've done, versus the same individual, the same team who go out, have a really terrible performance, don't score the goal, don't win the game, or don't win the competition, or whatever it is, and just how much they'll then analyze, start looking inwardly, start probably blaming themselves, all of the things that probably you do start learning from, and these opportunities. So that was probably going back to when I talk about this book and why it was such a game changer. And I suppose it introduced me to this whole concept of reframing and this psychological technique of, it's never actually what happens that's important to you. There's if I'm going to give you the highlights of my career, I'd probably say very fortunate to play nearly 20 years as a professional in the English leagues. I was, played internationally against the best teams in the world: Spain, Italy, France, Germany. Just so fortunate. Won championships. We played at Wembley. We, did all of these incredible things, and that's great because that's one angle of how you look at this sort of career. But the other side of this exact same coin, I'd be saying, well, I was released from every club I ever played for. And no coach ever paid £1, $1, 1 cent for me in my entire career. So how does that all end up into the same, mishmash of a 20-year professional footballing career? And unfortunately it is. That's just the way it goes. You have so many highs and lows, so many ups and downs. But actually, to answer your question, it was the learnings, it was the frustration, the anger, getting really peed off just because of a certain coach or another manager said, I just don't think you're good enough to play in this league or at this level. And it just gave me more and more hurt and anger, but also more and more motivation and resilience to be able to prove them wrong and also to prove me right. Because as much as I had an inferiority complex, when I met Jurgen Klinsmann, whenever I was 16 on my first day at Tottenham Hotspur, by 19, and as the story progressed, one of the players who came through the youth team with me made his debut against Manchester United in that kind of amazing team of, David Beckham and Roy Keane and Paul Scholes and all these outstanding players that Manchester United had in the late 90s. My youth team player who came through the same level of me played against Manchester United in the Premier League, live on TV, scored against them, and in the exact same moment, I suddenly shifted or switched the belief that I didn't think I was capable of doing it, but because he did it, then so could I. And 3 months later, I'd made my Premier League debut and scored on my home Premier League debut. And that for me was just such a massive change and shift in what's possible.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think there's just going back to kind of what you were saying at the beginning of that, how many people avoid failure? They work so hard not to fail that they almost probably don't reach their potential, right? Because they've avoided the failures that are going to make them eventually stronger in whatever it is that they're going to do. And I know coaching, being in the college game for 17 years, there's so many kids trying to avoid that failure moment that they just want to jump on to the next thing. The grass is always greener somewhere else, instead of sticking through something and maybe failing a little bit and maybe becoming stronger on the other side of it, like you're saying. I think we're missing some of those moments. So appreciate your valuable lesson that we can learn through your experiences at a really, really high level.
Yeah, I love that you kind of hit the flip side of what people will look at. They look at the resume and go, that's amazing, and it is, right? I mean, you had, as you said, you're extremely fortunate, got to do what a lot of people don't get to do, a lot of people strive for. I know my 11-year-old, that's his dream, is to play at the levels you got to play at. And and who knows, it happened for you. It could happen, you just got to see what that plan is. But the other side of it, you let go. People, as you said in your book, people don't care about you at the end of the day, right? You're very dispensable. I mean, they do, but what's that?
It's just a transaction.
Exactly. I was an attorney for 8 years, and I tell people, if you ever want to feel dispensable, go work at a law firm, because when they leave, when you leave, they don't, they don't throw a party for you. They're gone, and then they keep going, and somehow it keeps going without you. And they do. All the firms that I left are now way better and bigger than when I left them. So that's just the reality of life. And it's not to say, oh, we'll go through life in that way. No, go through life and go, you know what? There's opportunities to learn from those things and to take from it what you can. And you don't have to be that type of leader as well, right? You can be that transformational leader. What does that look like? And you wrote a book. So I love the title of this book. It might be one of my favorite titles of a book that I've seen, called "The Stupid Footballer is Dead." And how did you, first of all, why did you write this book? Because not a lot of people are writing books, especially these days. And how'd you come up with that title?
That is so weird that you asked that, because I actually had the title when I was 21, and I played for another 11 years. And then when I stopped playing at the age of 32, and then started writing it a year later when I went into work in the corporate world as this keynote speaker and delivering these leadership programs. And I just thought, I feel like I had a lot of understanding and knowledge of like the psychological principles or the framework of high performance. And I was constantly getting asked questions by whether it's people in the corporate world, people in the sporting world, whether it was, former players, current coaches, how did you do that? What you did? How do you implement the psychology of the mindset piece into the whole bigger performance element? And ultimately for me, it was just something that I'd always wanted to work on, because even when I made my debut at 19, the first thing I went and did was went and got a sports psychologist. Not because my career was going downhill and I was at this, real crossroads. It was more because I had already at that stage, and again, probably got it from the Tony Robbins book, that if that's the level I'm performing at, well, how do I get better? Because, technically, I'm probably not going to improve that much by the age of 20. You're virtually where you're going to be for most of your career. Physically, again, I'm only 5'6". What's that, like 1 meter 67? I'm not probably going to grow a lot. I can get a little bit stronger, a little bit bigger, but again, probably am where I am. But this massive growth area and the huge potential that I saw was around the psychology. So started doing things like visualizations, even practical applications, like started doing yoga. Again, you think yoga is a physical thing, and I didn't really do it for the meditative benefits or the mental benefits of yoga, but the fact that I was open-minded enough to start doing yoga when I was 17. And then that's a whole other story of what happened whenever I then probably didn't have the what's called the bravery, the cojones to bring my yoga mat into the Norwich City and go in, and just because I didn't feel like I was established to do it. But then once I started playing every week, scoring goals, become top scorer, I was like, I'm bringing this in. I'm kind of, feel like the main man here. And then what happened on my first day of bringing the yoga mat in, doing my yoga in the side of the room next to the physio room, I was getting so much abuse, mental abuse, verbal, physical things flying at me. But again, I was like, this is so weird. I'm just doing a little bit of yoga, and everyone else, because they'd never seen it before, was giving me dog's abuse. But of course, I went out training, came back in, and of course, they cut my yoga mat up into 100 little pieces. Oh. I'm like, right, that's it. As you'll get to know me, I'm a stubborn little guy. So I'm like, right, off to get another one, bought another one, brought in the next day. Same thing happened, loads of abuse before training, tried to hide the yoga mat this time. And then whenever I went back in after training, they literally set it on fire. They put it into this big bin and set it on fire. I'm like, right, you're not going to beat me. So then the third day, I went and got my third yoga mat, same thing, abuse. When they training came back, they brought it into the car park, and there was cars, they were doing skids and donuts and everything on. I'm like, oh my goodness. By the fourth day, they just got bored, Neanderthals, they just got bored, couldn't be bothered picking on me anymore. Until eventually, what do you think happened?
After they started doing yoga.
5 or 6 weeks, suddenly one of the guys just poked his head around the door and was like, Marka, what are you doing? And I went, I'm just doing some stretching. It's not rocket science. And they're like, but we're going to do that in the warm-up. And I said, yeah, but I feel like if I do this here, by the time I get out to the training field, then I will be 100% ready to go rather than 80% and warm up to get the 100%. He's like, all right. And of course, you can imagine where the rest of the story is. Within 3-4 months, I had about 5 or 6 of them doing yoga with me every morning. And the only thing I can say to this is not because, I wanted to be this kind of person to be different. It was just because it benefited me. And that's why I love this whole psychology piece. I'm the one that gets the benefits from it. I'm the one that whenever I left football after nearly 20 years, had one muscle injury. Now, is that a coincidence? Is it because I did the yoga? Who knows? But all I know is I benefited from it. And even whenever I came out of professional football, I then had this, what could have been a really tricky transition out of professional sport into doing something else. And for me, it was virtually seamless. And for nearly 15 years, I've now been doing this other world of, as I say, delivering lots of performance psychology for kind of multinationals and big companies like Microsoft and Cisco and KPMG and Deutsche Bank and everyone else. And just because I love this subject, I'm passionate about it. You can imagine being Irish, pretty good at talking, but actually being able to share this high performance framework that people in the corporate world don't normally come across. But actually, let's be honest, guys, in the sports world, most people don't do very little about.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And in that book, well, I mean, the first thing I love is we transcribe this show, and so I'm curious to see how cojones comes out in that transcript. But that's
in an
just
Irish accent as well, and
yeah,
that's going
just
to be
exactly. Oh, the Irish accent, that's going to be a train wreck when it comes to the transcript, but that's okay. But yeah, that's the things I think about as we're going through these interviews. That gives you a little, how the sausage is made here. But one of those, there's a few real, I mean, there's a lot of great stuff in the book. It's not, I say it's a quick read. It can be a quick read, but I would say, don't make it a quick read. One of the great parts about it, we'll put it in the show notes. You can get it on Paul's website for free. And that was a great thing. So the only thing for the American audience, you're going to have to deal with some S's where C's should be, and, some S's where I'll say Z's or Z's should be. But that's okay. We're not going to get into that conversation today. I've done that in other podcasts and it doesn't go very well. So, but it's a great book, and there's lots of great principles that we as business people, we as players, we as coaches, basically any human need to be able to learn. And it really goes along the theme of this show, which is, how are these principles from the game, from elite performance, from sports, and particularly football in this case, how does it translate to our life? How does it translate to the different things we're doing? And so there's a couple of those principles I do want to touch on today, but I want to make sure people know it's not just these couple. There's more to this. And definitely go grab that book. Definitely read the book. Definitely reach out to Paul if you have any questions about it. But the first one is this idea of think about thinking. And can you just talk about that, and maybe give a player you played with or an example of that you can help the audience understand what you mean by that?
Well, I suppose it just goes back to the end of what I just finished off with at the end of my answer, of how many people are working on their mindset, how many people are working on their psychology or attitudes, and ultimately this is just how we think. And because the majority of the time that I spent as a professional athlete, all of let's say our training was either technical or physical. And I'm thinking, right, I get that, because we all need to be a certain level technically, and physically you need to be, one of the best athletes in the world just to compete at that level. But actually, just to get into the door, just to get into the locker room, you need to be at that level. So once we're all at a certain level, what's then the greatest difference between players? And in my experience, it always came back down to their thinking, their way of thinking, their approach, their attitude, how they turned up every day, how they get over setbacks, how they dealt with getting dropped, how they dealt with missing a big chance in the last minute of a game, how they dealt with walking out in front of 2,000 people who might have been watching one day because there's hardly anyone there and you can't feel like you can perform, versus walking out in front of 75,000 people at Old Trafford and not being able to deal with that. So the only place that this happens or needs to be worked on is in people's heads. And if I were to ask, and I'm not making this into a session, guys, but if you two, as a very small sample size, if I were to say, but how much of your time do you consciously dedicate to improving the mental side of your performance? Well, if you're anything like the players that I've worked with in the Premier League over the past, whether it's the corporate audiences that I work with, if I'm in front of 25 Premier League players, maybe at a push, maybe 2 of them will say that they consciously dedicating time to improving their mental performance. And if I'm in front of a room full of 1,000 people, 500, 100 people, if we take it as a percentage, it's normally about 3%. People put their hands up and say, yeah, Paul, I'm working on that. Whether it's, I set goals for myself, I'm constantly writing down, reviewing, or I'll have affirmations, or I'll do vision boards, or I'll listen to podcasts, whatever it is. It's just such a tiny percentage. And it just shocks me, because I think that the amount of benefit that I've seen in my life, let me rephrase that. I made a decision a long, long time ago, probably in my early 20s, that the only thing I ever needed to work on in my life was my mindset, my psychology, my way of thinking, my attitude, my thought processes. Because if I get that right, every single other aspect of my life falls into place. That will dictate my career. It will dictate my relationships. It'll dictate my finances. It'll be my health and fitness. It'll be my self-esteem, my self-belief of what I'm capable of, my self-worth is all dictated to by how I think. And whenever you kind of lay it down in front of people like that and say, so how much are you doing? Most people go 0, very little. It's not for me to judge people because I'm in no position, and nor should I be judging anyone else, but more of an observation that, like, look how well for some people life is already going. And imagine if you added this, which is probably the most important part of life, in on top of what you're already doing. You see why some people's potential just suddenly gets reached once they add in. For me, this is the most important aspect of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things you say in that chapter that I love, it's a book. It's I first read it in the book "Switch on Your Brain" by Caroline Leaf, and she said, we can't control our circumstances, but we can control how we react to our circumstances. And I think that is so much of this, is that idea of, are you prepared for that? Are you prepared to know how to react to those failures, to the adversity, to the issues, to the successes? Because how you handle success is also something. Are you puffing up, or are you saying, okay, this is just one little mountain or hilltop? And it's probably gonna, there's gonna be failure, there's gonna be adversity, there's gonna be other things. So what does that look like? I love that part. And I wish we had hours and hours to talk about this, but we don't. So we're gonna move on to the next the one. We'll talk about this real quick too. And I love this one because I've seen this be an issue for so many players, so many people. I have 5 kids. All of my kids struggle with this. I struggle with this. Paul doesn't, of course, because Paul Jobson, that is perfect.
I'm not tall enough. I'm not tall enough to
that's
struggle
true.
with those things.
That's true. But this idea of mix. Actually, I think you probably do struggle with this a little bit at some point because we're small. We do this mix intensity with control. So can you talk about this very important thing? And I think particularly for athletes at higher levels, this is a hard one. So can you just touch on this? And I know you had some players. You talked about Balotelli and Joey Barton and Wayne Rooney versus Scott Parker in that chapter. And I don't know if you don't have time to necessarily go into all of that, but if you think about those players, you could get an idea of what we're talking about here. But can you just get into that a little bit?
Yeah, it's more to do with the fact of just realizing that it is a choice. It's always these decisions that we have, and the kind of the example that I use is that because I wasn't necessarily the most physical player, that I didn't always end up in these confrontations, probably more than most of the players who might have done. But also because I was an attacker and a striker, I was always getting kicked, so you always ended up in some sort of confrontation with a much bigger guy. But it's essentially to say the people who lose their control, who are always, getting into situations or reacting, probably, or maybe even just the fact that they're reacting rather than responding to things that happen to them on the field. And probably the example that I would use in my career is whenever we were playing against Millwall. It was a team in the Championship time. Always had a reputation for being a really, it was always a horrible game when you went down there. The crowd were giving you, literally dog's abuse from just walking along the sideline, or if you're a substitute or getting close to the side. And I remember just one tackle I had with a certain midfielder who went on to do very well for himself. I won't name him, but just because it doesn't sound very good from his part. But essentially, we both went in for a massive, 50-50 tackle. We both were like committed. We were going for it. Both went in, tried to do what we needed to do. We both hit each other, get up, and as we were about kind of like to go away and sort of as the ball skidded out the other side of the field, the referee just kind of saw the tackle, saw that nothing had happened, and as the ball went off, the referee turned his head and looked away, started running away, and at the same time, the player got up and turned around and just spat in my face. Now, for probably 99% of the people on a field, that's the lowest of the low. That's the sort of almost the permission that people can have to turn around and punch in the face, or to, stud him in the leg, or whatever you wanted to do, just react negatively. And I remember just as he did that, and I remember just very quickly to the corner of the eye, I could see the referee just give a quick look back. And of course, he didn't see him spitting at me, but he would have seen me punching the guy. And I, with all my might, and with all my little 5'6" frame, I wanted to destroy him at that stage. But because it was a decision, because I was able to control that intensity with the emotional self-control of everything my body said. I should react in a way, but instead I responded because I knew that if I had have gone the other way, I would have got sent off. We probably would have lost the game and the guy would have got one up on me. And that's that difference of just realizing that when you have the ability to choose in all these situations, that it's not necessarily just red mist comes down, someone tackles you, and you have to react in a way that's not going to benefit you or your team. There is a choice.
Yeah. Always found as a smaller player that always meant a little bit more to those guys. If they came after you and you did nothing, that almost made them more mad anyway. As much as you wanted to punch them or cleat them or whatever it was, they almost made them more mad that you didn't react at all. When I figured that out, I realized, okay, I think I got him right where I want him. But you're right. You still have to make that decision, right? You still have to make that decision every time that you're not going to get aggravated.
And that's what I had to do. I felt like I always had to outsmart my opponents, because again, technically I wasn't the best player in the team. I obviously wasn't the worst. I was just somewhere in the middle. Again, all the physical element, I was generally quite fast over 5 or 10 yards, but once over 20, 30 yards, bigger guys were outrunning me. So I always felt I had to try and outsmart my opponent to get the advantage. And even if that was me outsmarting them by saying things to them, just to try and put them off their game, because as what you can do of course, when you're on the field is you can say whatever you want. It might not be, very sportsmanlike, but you can say what you want as long as you don't go over the line. And as long as you don't end up physically hitting them, then you can say it, because if they react, then they'll get the red card and you'll be getting a little smile as they walk off down the tunnel. And again, that's all part of the game. It's all like the competitive element and the gamesmanship of what can you do to ensure that you win as long as you're staying within kind of the rules of the game.
Yeah, there's so much in there, and again, we probably could do 5 different episodes of podcasts, Phil, with Paul on these different topics. So we're just touching the tip of the iceberg with. But one thing I want to talk to you a little bit, Paul, before we kind of start to wrap things up. Obviously, playing the game at the highest level and against and with some of the best players to ever play the game. Alongside that, who were some of the best leaders that you came across as players you played with, players you played against? Who are the best leaders that you came across, and what was it that made them great leaders? That you think? I mean, what was it that made them great leaders in your mind as players? What sets them apart?
Very, very, very quickly, I'll give you the kind of top levels playing with them. In my debut team at Tottenham Hotspur, we had just some of the most incredible players. We had like Teddy Sheringham, who won the treble with Manchester United, went on the star with England up front with Alan Shearer. And again, speaking to him after he was the star of the English team in the Euro 96 European Championships, and going up to hit a penalty for his country in front of 90,000, and just realizing how calm he was and how he just took it all in his stride. That for me was just another element of leadership. It's just normal. This is what we do. Other people might struggle with this pressure, but for him, it was just like, it's just normal. It's fine. Through to the fact that we had Sol Campbell as the centre half in our team, and he went on to become one of the invincibles with Arsenal, playing in that team with Thierry Henry and Patrick Vieira and all the rest of those guys. And Sol just had this complete inner confidence that I probably have I ever seen it with anyone else? Maybe not, but definitely he was the first person that I just he didn't say a lot, very quiet, really introspective guy. But in terms of his ability to believe in himself and the confidence he just oozed and had around the place, for again, just another element of how leadership shows up, because there's so many different ways to be a leader, all the way through to, after the 6 years I had at Tottenham Hotspur, and by the time the manager told me to kind of move on, find another club, ironically because it was too small, and I went to Norwich City, and my first day training was with a guy called Craig Bellamy, and Craig Bellamy was only 17, and then Craig Bellamy went on to play for Liverpool and Man City and West Ham and just the most incredible player. But at 17, he was the leader within that Norwich City first team, because he was telling 32-year-olds, he was telling people who had won FA Cups, he was telling all these senior professionals what they should be doing and the standards that needed to be set, because he could see they weren't always attaining those. So there's such an array of characteristics and attributes that actually contribute to a leader. And I suppose they're just some of the things that I really loved, and then you try and apply them to yourself as well.
Yeah. You're not only do you have a a book out there, and obviously traveling the world, speaking to large organizations and companies and footballers and clubs around the world. You also have a podcast, right, as well. Why did you start the Psychology of Success podcast, and what do you hope people are going to learn from that as listeners?
I was just really fascinated, and I still am. And I did the first season of it. I just wanted to try and understand why other people are successful. I had a good idea of myself. I had a good idea of kind of the world of football and soccer, and trying to just broaden it out into different sports. Everything from rugby to the Olympics to actually we had NFL. We had a quarterback on there, all the way through to business. We've got like an entrepreneur who'd taken their business from like 3 million to 100 million, the people who had climbed Everest, single-handedly rode the Atlantic Ocean and cycled around the world. And you're just going, why do people do this? You wake up in the morning and you think, I might go for a 5K run today, or I might go for a little bike ride in the gym, or jump on the Peloton, or whatever you're doing. He's thinking, I might just go on and row the Atlantic Ocean. But
why not?
Him, it just comes back to this. It's almost like if you could visualize this little, so almost like a diagram. If you had a line at the top of the page and a line at the bottom of the page, and in between those two lines, you just wrote this 6-letter word that begins with N, and it's just normal. It's normal for me to go out and play in front of 75,000 people. I'm very fortunate, like when I was playing against Manchester United, Old Trafford, you score against Cristiano Ronaldo and his team, and Roy Keane and Ryan Giggs. And for people like my friend James Ketchell, it's just normal for him to think about climbing Everest or rowing the Atlantic or cycling around the world. And it does sound really cliche and really cheesy, but probably a good way to kind of end the conversation today is how do you raise your normal? And that is also, of course, there's a presupposition in there that you want to, or that you should do, or you need to. And I'm not suggesting that at all, but more, if your normal allows you to achieve or have the life that you want, you don't need to do anything. If, like most of the people I come across in work or in my personal life, are aspirational, have goals, have objectives, have things they're working towards, and what their normal currently is, they actually want to improve what their normal is. And so that for me is always, well, then how do you improve your normal? And for me, the only way to do that is by working on your mindset.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And we have questions we ask everyone at the end. I'm just going to ask you, do you have a recommendation, something you've watched, read, listened to that has most impacted your thinking on how football explains life and leadership?
I wouldn't necessarily of how football explains life and leadership. I listened to a podcast called the High Performance Podcast that I've got a couple of friends who are the hosts of it. So one of the guys is a guy called Jake Humphrey, who's a TV presenter over here, does BT Sport, and is just phenomenally successful in his TV career, and he has a film production business and everything. But he's the host of the High Performance Podcast. And then there's also a psychology expert in there, a guy called Professor Damien Hughes. And Damien has written books about Barcelona and Manchester United and all these different amazing institutions. But Damien's, just as you can imagine, as being a professor of psychology, very, very up to speed with the latest research. And between the two of them, they interview some of the most incredibly successful people across every industry on the planet. And so listening to those kind of people every day as I, go and walk the dog, or I'm commuting to work, or whatever I'm listening to it just keeps coming back to the same things. There's no silver bullet. There's no quick wins. There's no, give me the magic formula. Tell me what I need to do. It's like, no, you just keep working, you keep improving, you keep getting over the setbacks, you keep doing the best that you have with the resources you have at your fingertips. You keep challenging, you keep stepping outside your comfort zone. There's all of these same threads, no matter who they speak to, no matter what their background is. And that for me is just really good reassurance that essentially, if you want to work on something enough, and if you put enough time and effort, most of the times people will do what they want to do, because there's not a magic formula to it.
Yeah, no, I love that. Well, thank you so much, Paul. for being a part of the conversation today. Very, very much appreciate you, all you're doing. I hope we can get you back on and expand this conversation, because I know we could have gone much deeper and much longer on all these different things. So thanks a lot.
No, pleasure. And I'm actually going to be in the US in January. I'm speaking at the USC convention in Philly. So if anyone's listening, if anyone has some time to come along and listen to my sessions, or just wants to come up and say hello, then feel free to do that. Or of course, reach out on the socials, whether it's Instagram, Twitter, it's just Paul McVeigh 77, or as you said earlier, guys, feel free to head to my website, which is paulmcveigh.com, where you can go and download my book for free, because it's not a money-making opportunity. It's more just trying to spread the word.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, I can say from experience, Paul, the first time I was introduced to you was at the United Soccer Coaches Convention a few years ago, and heard you speak, and highly recommend, if anybody has the opportunity to listen to you, to do so. If they haven't gotten that just from listening to this podcast, they can figure that on their own by stepping into a room where you're on stage. And if anything, it's just the accent. You may not be saying anything, I'm not sure, Paul, but the accent is worth listening to.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Just kidding.
We always say that. We always say that.
If I had $1 for every time I heard that, I'd be a very rich man.
Yeah.
You know what, Paul, I don't get that being from Georgia, from South, the Southern United States. I don't get that accent. People like my accent as much. So you're very blessed, man. Blessed.
Never heard that. Paul Jobson and I, that is, have talked about taking accent lessons, because we'd probably get, more people listening to this. They think we're smarter, but that we haven't done that yet. So, but I was gonna mention that. I'm glad you did. We do have the United States Soccer, or I keep saying United States, United Soccer Coaches convention coming up here. It is in the United States in Philadelphia, but I'll be there with Paul, and we will have that link in the show notes. And so anything else you want to learn from this, that will be in the show notes. Anything we talked about today, paulmcveigh.com. You can click, you can just go there right now, McVeigh.com. And or you can go to the episode show notes for this, and you'll get it there. So all kinds of other stuff there in the show notes you can check out. If you listen to this podcast, we have some other things. Paul's doing more your way. We have Coaching the Bigger Game as well. But we will also hopefully see you January 11th through 15th in Philadelphia at the United Soccer Coaches Convention, where you will be able to hear Paul speak on different things. I'll be speaking there as well with a panel on DISC and retaining your players. So we got all that, but most importantly, with all this today, we hope that you're taking what you're learning today and using all of it to help you be a better leader in all that you do, a better parent, a better spouse, a better friend, and continually remind yourself that in this case today, since we're talking to a man from Belfast, football explains life and leadership. Thanks a lot. Have a great couple weeks.